Thank you very much. I want to thank you everybody for having me here today. Today I'm going to talk about the first project of my PhD. As you can see, this is quite a collaboration between a lot of people, and that's mainly because my background is very varied, and so I need this constant conversation with different people with different backgrounds to make it work. I will acknowledge all of these people that helped me, but I want to have a special mention for Sander Kimming, who's my daily supervisor of my PhD, and he's a very patient person. And this work is essentially the product of me and Sander sitting down and talking about the prevalence of control in biology. So that's also where I want to start my talk. I think there's a lot of examples of control in biology. Some of them are very evident. For example, our ability to control neuromuscular units, which as a consequence allows us to have a precise motor control over our own body. Other examples include maintaining homeostasis, for example, controlling the flow of hormones in the whole body, or also within the central nervous system. They can include the ability of some networks to control the activity of downstream networks. So within the brain, we know, and I hope we agree, that spikes underlie brain communication, and that spiking activity is found to be sparse and irregular. Now, when it comes to modeling control, this raises a dilemma because this irregularity is often considered to be noise, but at the same time, it's allowing for that precise control that we just talked about. So on one side, we can have balanced and realistic activity models, and on the other side, we can have effective control or effective computation to reach a task goal. And these two things are quite hard to merge together. So since I have a spike-centered perspective, whenever I encounter a control paradigm in the literature, I always ask myself these three questions. The first one is, does the model include spikes? The second one is how to make the control efficient. Now, I don't mean it in a control theory sense. I mean just how to make the model not spike too much or in an unrealistic way. And the third question is, how are the spikes actually involved in computing the control? So in the literature that I found, which is not an extensive list by any means, I found a rate-based control, which of course doesn't use spikes themselves. Then I found approximation of rate-based networks, which are still spiking networks. So they use spikes, but they're not necessarily realistically spiking, and it's not always clear how the spikes are involved in computing the control signal. And then finally, I found these approaches with very regular, non-realistic spiking activity. An example here is a raster plot on the right, in which basically what matters for the computation is the amount of spikes in a certain time bin, which means that we can kind of revert this back indirectly to a rate-based control. So the approaches of the literature weren't really convincing me, so I wanted to come up with my own approach. And to do that, I needed on one side a spiking rule to produce the spikes, and on the other side a system to control. So for the spiking rule, we looked at this seminal paper by Berlin and Machens, which introduced the greedy spiking hypothesis. Essentially, they take the perspective of a single neuron and they pose a greedy firing condition, which means that that single neuron will produce a spike, only if this decreases a certain loss. Now, the loss can be defined, for example, as the distance towards a target in state space. It can be defined as how accurately I want to represent a signal. So it's a very general rule, but it's fully local. So it takes the perspective of single neurons. From this simple rule, they derive a recurrent spiking neural network in an EI balance that's robust to perturbations, and it's also, most importantly, irregular and has an irregular sparse activity, which is what we were looking for when asking ourselves those questions. The problem with the study is that they don't do explicit control of downstream systems. They are just representing a signal. However, now we have our spiking rules. What we were lacking is a system to control. For the system, we choose this candidate, which is the spring mass damper system. It's a two-dimensional linear system. Here is represented within this dotted rectangle. It's essentially a mass attached to a spring, which oscillates. And then we have a damper, which is going to decrease the amplitude of those oscillations until the mass goes back to its equilibrium point, to its stable state. Outside of this dotted rectangle, there's the classic approach to control this system, which involves having a target state and then computing a control signal to change our position of the mass to trace a certain target. We'll first focus on what's inside the rectangle. This is simply a spring mass damper, as I described before. So this is an example in which we stretch the mass. So we stretch the spring and then we let go. And of course, velocity and position are gonna at first oscillate, and then the amplitude decreases, and we arrive at a stable state, as we said before. We can also plot velocity and position against each other, and this is the kind of visualization that we will have in the rest of the talk. Essentially, there's a classical way to control this kind of system, which is also the optimal control solution, using that closed control loop we saw before. What changed here is that now we have a target, which is this gray line that we can see in both visualizations. And the target is only set to be a position. So we're only trying to match the x component of our trajectory to the gray line, essentially. The velocity can change freely. And what we do is we compute the distance between our target and our state. And then from that, we compute a control signal, which is constantly inputted into the system. And the control signal only influences the velocity of the system. As a consequence, this will change the position of the mass to trace our target. So this is the classic approach to control this problem. So that's great. And now we have a spiking rule and a system to control and a control problem to face, essentially. And it turns out this actually was already solved by Sander himself with Philip Slackhouse and Pablo Lanilos. They essentially take the system and they substitute this classical control approach that we just saw, this continuous control, which is called LQR, linear quadratic regulator. They substitute that with a spiking neural network. So essentially, this is how the approach works. There is a spiking neural network. It produces some spikes. The spikes are converted into filtered spike trains, and then the filtered spike trains are mapped to form a continuous control signal. So in this case, as we can see here, it's very simple. We just have two neurons, the orange and the blue one, and they're spiking quite a lot. And what happens is that the neurons are spiking and they are representing the signal, but then the control signal itself is still continuous. So it's approximating the optimal control solution that we saw before. So this doesn't really answer all of my three questions, because yes, the network is spiking, but the spike themselves are just for the representation of the system and they're not really used for computation, and it's also spiking quite a lot. So I would rather take a different approach, which is having direct spiking control. This means that essentially we are going to inject the spike events directly into the dynamics of the systems. And then once a spike is injected, we just let the system evolve in open loop. So we stop trying to control the system until we spike again. So to have an intuition of what this means, essentially the previous approach would be like moving the mass continuously to approach a certain control target, right? Whereas now we are kind of kicking the mass using our spikes, and then we are letting the system evolve until the next spike. So this is kind of our different approach. Of course, this means that our spiking rule is essentially at the same time controlling the system itself. So choosing the spiking rule is the most important thing here. So I will start with the most naive approach that we could possibly have, which is essentially to use the same greedy spiking rule that we mentioned before without changing it at all. So here we have a super simple example. We have our brown dot, which is our starting state, and then we have our gray dot, which is our target state. Let's suppose that we have a network of 4 neurons, and the spike of each neurons is mapped into a different direction in the state space. If we apply our naive greedy spiking rule, the only neuron that's allowed to spike is the one that is mapped towards the right. And that's because that's the only spike that is immediately decreasing the distance towards the target. So every other spike, as you can see, is going to get us further away from the target than the initial point. So those neurons are not going to spike. And sure enough, that is what happens if we try to run the simulation. So the position is just continuously spiked towards the target position, and that's all that happens. Of course, this is not very satisfactory to me, mainly because this is physically unrealistic. Because the spike is a instantaneous event, and if we apply it to the position, it means that we are essentially changing the position of the mass in 0 seconds. So we are essentially teleporting the mass towards the target. This is, of course, not a way to control a system. A more realistic SMD simulation would only allow us to spike the velocity up and down in the state space, and it would not allow us to spike the position. Of course, if we apply this naive approach, to a physically constrained system, where, as you can see here, we can only spike up and down, the control fails. And it fails because from this initial point, spiking up or spiking down is actually not taking us any closer to the target. So the network just never spikes and the control is not activated. So this means that we need to change our approach. And in particular here, we will take a predictive approach where essentially we spike, then we wait for f seconds, and we wait for the dynamics of the system to take us wherever they take us, and then we compute the distance towards the target once we arrive at that point. So as we can see here, even in this unconstrained example where we can spike in every direction, the best spike is now the one that goes upwards, because then we can wait for the dynamics to take us here, which is way closer to the target than all the other options. So essentially, we want to work with this loss inequality, which now looks into future windows. And then we want to derive a voltage threshold inequality from there. And then we derive, actually, we obtain a recurrent network of integrate and fire neurons. And this is how our control loop is going to look like. So we have a target state and a system state. We have forward connections for each of those that map those quantities into our network, which is recurrent. The network produces spikes, and the spikes are the control signals themselves. The control signals are there, mapped onto the system via our matrix B. So that's kind of our setup. And sure enough, when we go to control a physically constrained system in which we can only spike up and down, in this case, we only have two neurons, so it's a super simple case. The orange neuron will spike the velocity up, and the blue neurons will spike the velocity down. And our network adjusts this to consequently make the position trace our control target. We can have also this nice animation of the same simulation happening. As we can see, when the target is not changing for some seconds, all we can do is essentially orbit the target by spiking up and then waiting some seconds and then spiking up again. So this approach is not approximating an optimal control, but is answering all of my three initial questions, because the model includes spikes, the model is not spiking as much as the previous approaches, and the spikes are directly involved into the control. If we take a little bit of a more complex example here, we have a more funky changing target, and we have four neurons, two spike up and two spike down. But the functioning of the whole system is the same. We have a predictive error, which is essentially the distance towards the target in f seconds into the future. And when that changes, this influences the value of our voltages until some voltages reach the threshold. That produce some spikes that are mapped onto the velocity of the system. Here is the green line, which as a consequence changes our position to trace our target. So this is kind of the basic setup that we have. Of course, I also wanted to explore a more complex system staying in the linear regime. So I tried to apply this to a coupled oscillator with 10 different spring mass damper systems that are coupled with each other. So the position of one influences the acceleration of the one it's connected to. We have 10 different target positions, as we can see here in panel B. And what happens is that the network, which is now 500 neurons, so of course everything is scaled up, can now control each one of those positions to reach our target. For free, we got all of the nice features of the greedy spiking rule that we mentioned before. So we have this sparse and irregular activity, and it's also very robust to cell silencing. So in the 30 and 70 seconds in the simulation, I silenced quite some cells of the network. But since it's a local rule, the spiking activity just gets remodulated into the remaining neurons, and the spike performance is not really affected here. So this is basically my setup right now, and for the future outlook, I want to tackle unknown dynamics. So essentially, I won't assume that I know the dynamics in the future, and I assume that I have to somehow learn those. And I also clearly want to tackle nonlinear system, because that's the next reasonable thing to do. Of course, feel free to suggest any other future direction. I'm very interested in that. I want to acknowledge everybody that participated in this project. Andre and Pablo did some previous work that is very related to this and helped me. Sander and Nasir are my daily supervisors. Luke and Husen helped me with the model design. And finally, Marcel is the PI of my lab and is the main promoter of my PhD. Finally, I want to thank you all for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Paolo. That was great. There are a few questions in the Q&A, so I'm just going to read the most highly voted ones. Is your predictive controller somehow related to a PID controller, at least to the D part?
I should look into that. I'm not exactly sure what we mean here. But I think the original work also from the Neven Markens has some elements of that. So I'm bound to say yes, but I would need to check that.
Okay, maybe
If
something
you
for
can
your
have the name
future
of who
work.
asked, I can also contact them and
It's somebody with the initials SPK, so I suggest that you
okay,
find that person after the talk and you reach out to
nice.
them, can exchange details. The
Will
full
do,
name is
will
not
do.
here. Okay, great. Okay, so there's another question about the spiking rule. So is the greedy spiking rule, the greedy spiking rule assumes that the neuronal membrane potential encodes the error signal. For
Yeah.
that, all somas need to be connected to all other somas, so all-to-all connectivity. How would your spike-based control work if connectivity is sparse?
That's a good question. I think the main, this is really the main assumption of the model, is the fact that we can somehow represent the error signal into our voltages. So I think a lot of this locality principle would be lost if we don't have this anymore. So I think that the main effect of that would be that we wouldn't it wouldn't be sufficient anymore to have only this local rule if we don't have this type of connectivity. I think that would be the main effect. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. The next question is about other examples of a control task. So this one is referring to EI balance, is another classical example of a control task. Can it be used to control oscillators as well? If not, why?
Well, essentially, if we mean oscillator in a general sense, this is a coupled oscillator, for example. I'm not sure what you mean by what is related with the EI balance there.
I think they sort of mean, I mean, there are many ways to implement, I don't know exactly, this is Andrei Formozov from Heidelberg University, but I suspect they mean that EI balance is indeed a way to control or constrain something in the system, although there's many different ways to achieve that. So, I mean, I think the spiking rule that you use already in some sense balances E and I. That's kind of
Yeah,
how the rule works.
yeah.
So maybe that's something that you can follow up on with Andrei to clarify
Yeah,
more the
I think
details.
yeah, this EI balance is indeed a consequence of representing errors in our voltages, indeed. So it's embedded in the way we represent voltages, and I think this extends to mainly all oscillators and for sure every system that is linear. But again, of course, it's not guaranteed for nonlinear system because we cannot compute that with certainty in nonlinear systems. We cannot predict the future state of the system accurately.
Okay. Have you tried models that are inherently unstable? So linear, nonlinear, like inverted pendulum, that is a benchmark system in control theory.
Yeah, this is going to be definitely my next step. I'm now focusing more on the learning, but it's indeed the next idea that we have. There's a bunch of approaches that we can try with that. The classic approach is kind of a local linearization, which I'm not sure exactly how it will work, but another thing that we can do is have multiple prediction of future states to see where in the state space we end up being after some seconds. But I haven't tested this yet, but it's an exciting next step, and I'm also taking any feedback about that as well.